So, how does one single bullet fired on some street corner end up sparking a war that kills 20 million people and literally shatters empires? I mean, it's a conflict that changed the world forever, and today we're gonna break down exactly how it all kicked off.
You know, it almost sounds like something out of a movie, right? But it's true. In 1914, one gunshot really was the spark that ignited a global firestorm. So you gotta ask, how did this even happen? Did the entire world just stumble into a catastrophe that massive? Or was Europe basically a powder keg just waiting for someone to light the fuse? Well, let's find out.
Okay, so first, we have to go right back to that single moment, the shot that really did change everything.
All right, the date is June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who's the heir to the massive Austro-Hungarian Empire, is visiting Sarajevo. And boom, he's assassinated. The shooter was just a young guy, a nationalist from a group called Young Bosnia. And this one act, it sets off an insane chain reaction. Exactly 1 month to the day, Austria-Hungary declares war, pointing the finger at the entire country of Serbia.
But let's be real, this wasn't really about justice. Austria-Hungary hands Serbia this ultimatum with a list of demands so ridiculous, so over the top, that there was no way they could ever accept them. See, the assassination wasn't the reason for the war, it was the perfect excuse. So yeah, the assassination was the trigger, for sure, but it wasn't the real cause. The continent was already a tinderbox, just packed with tension and ready to explode. So let's take a look at all the fuel that was just sitting there, waiting. You know, to understand what was going on, historians have this super useful acronym, MAIN. It stands for the 4 big, long-term causes that pretty much made this war inevitable: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. First up, M is for militarism. Europe was tangled up in this massive arms race. Seriously, every major nation was glorifying military power. You had Germany building up its army like crazy, and Britain was pouring tons of money into its navy to rule the seas. War wasn't this horrible last resort. It was actually seen as a good way to get what you wanted. Next, A for alliances. The whole continent was connected by this tangled web of secret treaties. The idea was supposed to be about keeping a balance of power, right? But what it really did was create a gigantic tripwire. One little fight in one corner of Europe could now pull everybody in. Then we've got I for imperialism. All the major European powers were in this intense competition to grab up colonies and resources all over Africa and Asia. This created some really bitter rivalries, and it meant that when a war did start, it wasn't just going to be a European war, it was going to pull in people from all over the world. And finally, N for nationalism. And look, this was way more than just being patriotic. This was an aggressive, intense belief that your nation was superior to all the others. This fueled this constant desire to dominate, and it created major tension points, like in the Balkans, where Serbian nationalists wanted to unite all Slavic people, which you can imagine was a huge threat to the very diverse Austro-Hungarian Empire. So you can see how all these MAIN factors created this incredibly volatile situation, right? The assassination was just the spark that lit the fuse. Now let's watch how that alliance system worked like a set of dominoes, knocking over one country after another into war. And just like that, Europe split into 2 teams. On one side, you had the Central Powers. That's mainly Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And facing off against them were the Allied powers, which included France, Britain, and Russia, who, remember, had that treaty to protect Serbia. And what's crazy is how fast this all went down. In just a single week, all those tripwires were hit. Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia, so Russia starts mobilizing to help Serbia. That makes Germany declare war on Russia. Then Germany declares war on France and invades Belgium to get there, and that's the final straw for Britain, which had promised to protect Belgium. Boom, the whole continent is at war.
You know, at the start, a lot of people thought this would all be over by Christmas. Instead, it dragged on for 4 absolutely brutal years. And the consequences? Well, they would alter the entire world. The human cost is it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. We're talking about 20 million people, soldiers and civilians, dead, and another 21 million wounded. This was industrialized killing on a scale humanity had never, ever seen before. By the time the dust settled, the world looked completely different. 4 massive ancient empires had literally collapsed. The Russian Empire was gone, toppled by revolution. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was torn apart by all those nationalist movements. And the German and Ottoman empires, they were dismantled after their defeat. Just gone. Now, the United States had tried to stay neutral for a long time, but that all changed when Germany's submarines started sinking ships that had American citizens on board. That was the tipping point. The US jumped in 1917, and its industrial power and fresh soldiers really helped turn the tide, cementing America's new position as a dominant world power. But even when the war finally ended in 1918, things didn't just snap back to normal. Not even close. The conflict left behind these deep, lasting scars that, in many ways, we can still see today.
It wasn't just about changing borders on a map. The war completely transformed entire societies. And one of the biggest, most unexpected changes had to do with the role of women.
I mean, think about it. With millions of men fighting at the front, someone had to keep the countries running. Women flooded into factories and offices, doing jobs they'd never been allowed to do before. This new economic freedom gave a huge boost to the fight for women's right to vote, and a lot of countries granted it right after the war. But on the flip side, nations were financially ruined, buried in debt, and facing massive inflation.
And we really have to remember, this was a world war, not just a European one. I mean, just look at British India. Over 1.5 million Indian soldiers fought for the Allies all over the world. The famous India Gate in Delhi, that was built to honor the 70,000 of them who never made it back.
And this might be the war's most tragic legacy of all. The peace treaties, especially the Treaty of Versailles, were designed to be so humiliating for Germany. The anger, the resentment, the economic ruin it caused, it didn't create a lasting peace. It just planted the seeds for the next, even deadlier war.
So that brings us to one last big question to think about. If you could go back and remove just one of those 4 M's, alliances, arms race, or rival empires, could the Great War have been avoided? Or was a disaster of this size just bound to happen?